A millionaire fell for a homeless woman he took in, but her past made him question everything. The storm raged outside Ethan Calloway's grand estate, a fortress of glass and steel that stood like an untouchable monument to his success. The rain lashed against the towering windows, the wind howling through the trees that lined his expansive property. Inside, the air was silent, sterile, just the way he liked it. Ethan sat in his dimly lit study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the mahogany desk. He stared at the glowing screen of his laptop, scanning numbers and reports that meant everything to his business empire, but nothing to him. He had long since stopped feeling anything beyond the thrill of closing a deal. Love, warmth, connection, those were luxuries he had learned to live without. A sharp crack of thunder shook the walls, snapping him from his thoughts. He turned toward the window, frowning as the security lights flickered against the rain-soaked driveway. And then he saw it, a small, crumpled figure lying near the gate, motionless. His first instinct was to look away, to call security and let them handle it. But something about the way she lay there, fragile yet defiant against the storm, made him hesitate. His jaw tightened. He didn't involve himself in other people's problems. It was easier that way. But before he could convince himself to ignore it, his feet were already moving. The cold rain bit into his skin as he stepped outside, his coat barely shielding him from the storm's fury. As he approached, he saw her more clearly, a young woman, her clothes soaked through, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if trying to disappear into the pavement. Strands of wet, tangled hair clung to her pale face, her lips trembling from the cold. He crouched beside her, his sharp eyes scanning for signs of life. "Hey!" His voice was firm, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something unfamiliar. Concern. "Can you hear me?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, a striking shade of green, clouded with exhaustion and wariness. She stared at him, her body stiffening as if expecting the worst. "I don't need your help," she rasped, her voice hoarse, defensive. Ethan's brow furrowed. "You're barely conscious." She tried to push herself up, but her limbs betrayed her. He caught her just before she collapsed again, his grip steady but impersonal. "You don't have a choice right now," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. For a long moment, she stared at him, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. Then, finally, she stopped resisting. With a resigned breath, she let him lift her into his arms. As he carried her toward the house, questions swirled in his mind. Who was she? How had she ended up here, alone in the storm? And why, after years of carefully constructing walls around himself, did he feel a strange pull toward this woman? A woman who clearly had secrets of her own. He didn't know it yet, but that night would change everything. Inside, as the door shut behind them, sealing out the storm, Ethan realized he was already in too deep, and he had no idea what he had just let into his life. The soft glow of the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the guest house, illuminating the sparse but comfortable space Ethan had reluctantly offered to Lena. The rain had long since stopped, leaving behind a crisp chill in the air. Wrapped in an oversized robe James had provided, Lena sat stiffly on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. Ethan stood near the door, arms crossed, watching her with unreadable eyes. "You can stay here until you figure out your next move," he said flatly. "But let's be clear, this isn't a permanent arrangement." Lena lifted her gaze, meeting his with quiet defiance. "I didn't ask to stay." His jaw tightened. "You would have frozen to death if I'd left you outside. This isn't about charity, it's about practicality." She didn't argue, but something in her expression told him she resented being treated like a problem that needed solving. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "James will bring you food and anything else you need. But I don't want any trouble, and I don't want lies." At that, her expression flickered, just for a second before she nodded. Ethan didn't trust that silence. There was something about her, something guarded and unspoken, that made his instincts flare. He turned toward the door. "Get some rest." She didn't respond, and he left without another word. The first few days passed with a tense routine. Ethan rarely saw Lena, and when he did, their conversations were clipped and impersonal. She never asked for anything, never complained. She kept to herself, cleaning up after meals she hadn't cooked, disappearing into the guest house without so much as a sound. But Ethan was watching. He noticed how she always seemed alert, as if expecting danger. He caught her staring too long at the grand estate, her expression unreadable. She moved carefully, deliberately, like someone used to being on edge. James, his butler of 15 years, was the only one who seemed unfazed by her presence. "She's not what you think," James remarked one evening as he set down Ethan's coffee. Ethan didn't look up from his laptop. "And what do I think?" James smiled knowingly. "That she's a liar, that she's using you. But sometimes people carry burdens they can't explain. Doesn't mean they're dishonest." Ethan scoffed. "You're too trusting." James shook his head. "You're too afraid to be wrong about people." Ethan had no response to that. That night, restless and unable to sleep, Ethan found himself walking past the guest house. He didn't know why. Maybe it was James's words still rattling around in his head. Maybe it was the strange pull Lena had on his thoughts. Through the window, he could see her curled up on the bed, her body tense even in sleep. Then suddenly, she began to tremble. Ethan frowned, stepping closer. Her breath hitched, her fingers clawing at the blanket as if trying to fight something off. Then, a broken whisper slipped past her lips. "No, please don't." A name followed, barely audible, but it sent a strange chill through him. He didn't recognize it. Lena gasped awake, bolting upright, her chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven breaths. Without thinking, Ethan pushed open the door. She flinched at the sound, her eyes wide with panic before recognition set in. What are you doing here?" Ethan ignored the question. "You were having a nightmare." She swallowed hard, pressing a shaking hand to her forehead. "It's nothing." It wasn't nothing. He could see it in her eyes, the fear that hadn't quite faded, the tension in her frame. She looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't known real rest in a long time. Ethan didn't move. "Who were you talking about?" Lena's head snapped up, her expression immediately guarded. "I wasn't talking about anyone." His jaw clenched. "You said a name." Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Then, Lena let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You really are suspicious of me, aren't you? I don't trust people who hide things." She met his gaze with an unreadable expression. "It's a good thing I don't trust anyone at all." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Lena shifted, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "Go back to your perfect house, Ethan. Whatever you think you saw, it's none of your concern." Ethan should have walked away. He should have told himself it wasn't his problem. But as he looked at her, sitting in the dim light, haunted by whatever ghosts lived in her past, he realized something unsettling. He wanted to know more, and that was dangerous. Lena woke before dawn, her body aching from years of sleeping on cold concrete, but she pushed past the discomfort. She owed Ethan more than gratitude. She owed him effort. With silent determination, she stepped into the vast, gleaming kitchen of the estate, where James, the butler, raised an eyebrow at her arrival. "You're up early," he observed, setting down a silver tray. "Guests usually sleep in." "I'm not a guest," Lena replied, tying her hair back. "I want to help." James studied her for a long moment before nodding. "If you insist." He handed her an apron. "Just don't let Mr. Calloway catch you scrubbing floors." Lena got to work, moving through the house with quiet efficiency. She swept corridors, wiped down windows, and arranged books in a massive library. The more she worked, the less she felt like a helpless burden. She would not be pitted. Ethan, observing from the upper level, was perplexed. He had expected resistance, defiance even, but instead, she worked with a quiet dignity that unsettled him. Why did he care? Why did it bother him to see her working as though she owed him something? That evening, as he passed the library, he noticed her curled up in an armchair, completely engrossed in a book. He hesitated at the doorway, watching her. She wasn't just skimming. She was lost in the words, her fingers tracing the pages as if absorbing every detail. "You read." Ethan's voice broke the silence. Lena startled, but quickly composed herself. I used to, she said carefully. Before. Before what? Ethan wanted to ask, but she shut the book, guarding whatever past she was unwilling to share. He crossed the room, glancing at the title. A collection of poetry. Unexpected. I assumed that I couldn't read? Lena challenged softly. Ethan exhaled. That you wouldn't be interested in poetry. Lena gave a small, knowing smile. People assume a lot of things. He found himself studying her, the firelight catching the sharp planes of her face, the defiance in her eyes. She wasn't like anyone he had ever met. There was a depth to her, a mystery that made him uneasy. The next morning, Ethan left a neatly wrapped box on the dining table where she usually had her coffee. A simple gesture, nothing extravagant, just a warm coat, something practical, something she clearly needed. But when she saw it, she frowned. I can't take this. It's just a coat, Ethan said, watching her reaction carefully. It's charity. It's survival. She lifted her chin. I'm surviving just fine. Ethan felt irritation stir. Why did she have to be so stubborn? Why couldn't she just take the damn coat? You're impossible. Lena met his gaze, unyielding. I'm not here to be saved. That night, Ethan sat in his office, unable to focus. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the way she looked when she read, completely unguarded, and the way she refused his help, as if accepting kindness was more terrifying than the life she had come from. He switched on the TV absent-mindedly, but his attention snapped into focus when he heard the news anchor's voice. Authorities are still searching for a missing woman linked to... Ethan glanced toward the hallway. Lena was standing just outside the room, staring at the screen, her face pale as death. Then, without a word, she turned and disappeared into the shadows. His stomach clenched. What was she running from? Ethan paced his office, fingers drumming against the mahogany desk as his thoughts tangled in frustration. Lena had been living under his roof for weeks now, yet he knew almost nothing about her past. Every attempt to pry even a fragment of information from her was met with an unyielding wall of silence. Tonight had been no different. I don't know you my life story, Lena had said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in her eyes. I'm grateful for what you've done, Ethan, but that doesn't mean I have to hand over my past on a silver platter. Her defiance both irritated and intrigued him. He was used to control, to having access to everything and everyone in his world. But Lena remained an enigma, one he couldn't shake from his mind, no matter how hard he tried. Meanwhile, the outside world was beginning to take notice of the mysterious woman living in his guest house. A knock at the office door pulled him from his thoughts. James stepped in, a cautious expression on his usually composed face. Sir, you should see this, he said, handing Ethan a folded newspaper. The headline made Ethan's stomach tighten. Runaway socialite or wanted woman. Ethan's eyes scanned the article, his jaw clenching with each word. While it didn't directly name Lena, the details were eerily close. A woman matching her description, connected to a past scandal that had once made headlines, had vanished without a trace. The article hinted at embezzlement, betrayal, and a powerful family desperate to find her. His mind spun with possibilities. Was Lena truly an innocent woman trying to rebuild her life? Or was she hiding something darker? He needed answers, and if she refused to give them willingly, he'd find them himself. As he reached for his phone, intent on hiring a private investigator, a voice interrupted him. Are you really doing this? Ethan turned sharply to find Lena standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her arms crossed over her chest as if bracing for a storm. Doing what? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Digging into my past behind my back, she said, her voice void of emotion, but her eyes betrayed the hurt she tried to conceal. Ethan hesitated. He had always prided himself on being direct, but for some reason, facing Lena now, he struggled to find the right words. I need to know who you are, he admitted. How do I know you're not dangerous? That you're not using me? Lena let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. So that's what you think of me? I should have known. She turned to leave, but Ethan took a step forward, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Lena, wait. She spun around, eyes flashing. No, Ethan. I trusted you more than I should have. But you? You don't trust me at all. With that, she walked away, leaving Ethan standing in the suffocating silence of his office. The walls between them had never felt higher, and for the first time, Ethan wondered if he had just pushed her too far. Lena sat on the edge of her bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She had suspected Ethan would eventually dig into her past, but hearing it confirmed was like a knife to the gut. She should leave. It would be easier that way. Safer. Yet, as much as she wanted to convince herself to walk out that door, something held her back. Ethan, despite everything, despite the betrayal, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him, and that terrified her more than anything else. Because if Ethan ever learned the truth about her past, she knew there would be no turning back, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. Ethan stormed out of his office, his mind still tangled in the web of doubt and frustration Lena had unknowingly woven around him. His thoughts were a chaotic mix of suspicion and something else, something he refused to name. The sharp crack of thunder outside did little to ease his mood as he made his way down the stone steps of his estate. The rain had started again, soaking the pavement, making everything slick. He barely registered the danger before his foot slipped off the last step. A sharp pain shot through his ankle as he landed hard. A groan escaped his lips, his pride stinging just as much as his injury. He tried to push himself up, but a wave of pain stopped him. The sound of hurried footsteps followed, and before he could snap at whoever was approaching, a familiar voice reached him. Ethan! Lena dropped to her knees beside him, her eyes wide with concern. I'm fine, he gritted out, attempting to stand. She pressed a firm hand to his shoulder. You're not. Let me help. He wanted to push her away, to keep his distance, but there was something about the way she looked at him, genuine, unguarded. Against his better judgment, he let her support him as she guided him back into the house. His butler, James, offered assistance, but Ethan waved him off. It was Lena who had insisted on helping, and for some reason, he found himself allowing it. As she helped him settle onto the couch, she knelt before him, her hands gentle yet confident as she assessed his injury. You're lucky, she muttered, examining the swelling around his ankle. It's not broken, but it's going to hurt for a while. He studied her, his usual mask of indifference slipping. You seem to know what you're doing. Lena hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing to wrap his ankle with a cloth. I used to take care of my little brother when he got hurt. Her voice was softer than usual, almost wistful. It was rare for her to speak about her past, and Ethan found himself holding his breath, afraid she might shut down if he pressed too hard. What happened to him? The words left his lips before he could stop them. A shadow passed over her face, but she didn't withdraw. He didn't make it. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. The grief in her voice was raw, unfiltered. It reminded him of his own childhood pain, the loneliness that had carved deep wounds within him. He had never spoken about it, never wanted to, but now, with Lena sitting so close, a part of him wanted to share something too. I had a brother once, he said quietly. He was older. He was supposed to protect me, but he left instead. Lena's hands stilled for a moment before she met his gaze. I'm sorry. He hadn't expected her to say that. He hadn't expected her to understand. But looking into her eyes, he realized she did. They sat in silence, the air between them heavy with something unspoken. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't alone in his pain. Lena finished tending to his injury and started to pull away, but Ethan caught her wrist. Who are you running from? He asked, his voice low. She stiffened. I don't know what you mean. You do. His grip was gentle but firm. You talk in your sleep, Lena. You call out names. And tonight, when James turned on the news, you flinched. Her breath hitched, her pulse quickening beneath his fingers. I don't want to talk about it. Ethan knew he should let it go. She had built walls around herself, just as he had, and pressing too hard would only make her retreat further. But for some reason, he couldn't stand the thought of her suffering alone. You don't have to tell me everything, he said after a long pause. But I need to know if you're in danger. Lena hesitated, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but then she shook her head. I can handle it. Ethan exhaled sharply, his frustration mounting. But at the same time, something else stirred within him, a fierce, inexplicable urge to protect her, even from herself. "Fine," he muttered, releasing her wrist. "For now." Lena rose to her feet, her expression unreadable. "You should rest." As she turned to leave, Ethan found himself watching her, his mind racing with questions. He had spent years keeping his emotions locked away, refusing to let anyone get too close. But now, with Lena in his life, those walls were beginning to crack, and that terrified him more than anything else. The evening air was thick with tension as Lena stood in the dimly lit hallway, her small bag clutched in her trembling hands. She had made up her mind. She needed to leave. Ethan was getting too close, his piercing eyes unraveling the wall she had built around herself. It was safer this way. Safer for him. Safer for her. Just as she reached for the doorknob, a firm hand gripped her wrist. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned to see Ethan standing behind her, his expression unreadable, but his stormy blue eyes burned with something dangerously close to desperation. "Going somewhere." His voice was low, edged with something Lena couldn't quite define. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. "It's time for me to go." Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. "You think you can just walk away? After everything?" She met his gaze, forcing herself to stand tall. "I was never meant to stay, Ethan." His jaw tightened. "You keep running, Lena. But what are you running from?" Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. She could feel the battle waging inside him. Concern, frustration, something deeper he refused to acknowledge. But she couldn't give him what he wanted. The truth was too dangerous. "I can't do this," she whispered, looking away. "I don't belong here." Ethan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "That's not an answer, Lena. You owe me the truth." She flinched. The truth. If only it were that simple. Before she could reply, the sharp ring of Ethan's phone cut through the tense silence. He pulled it out, his expression darkening as he answered. "What is it?" Lena didn't need to hear the other end of the conversation to know something was wrong. The way Ethan's entire body tensed, the way his grip on the phone tightened, it sent chills down her spine. When he hung up, his gaze locked onto hers, unreadable yet accusing. "Care to explain why a private investigator is looking into you?" Lena's breath hitched. "No, it was happening. He was close, too close. I don't know what you're talking about." Ethan stepped forward, the intensity in his stare pinning her in place. "Lena," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Who the hell is Alexander Grayson?" Her world tilted. Her knees nearly buckled at the name she had spent so long trying to forget. The room suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. Ethan caught every flicker of emotion in her eyes. Fear, pain, something that resembled regret. His hands curled into fists. "You were engaged to him." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A cold, damning fact. Lena turned away, swallowing the lump in her throat. "It's not what you think." Ethan let out a bitter laugh, stepping back as if she had physically struck him. "Not what I think. You let me believe you were just some homeless woman in need of help. And all this time, you were running from a powerful man." She clenched her fists. "I never lied to you, Ethan." "No," he said, his voice cutting. "You just never told me the truth." The pain in his eyes was unbearable, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "You wouldn't understand." Ethan's expression hardened. "Then make me understand." She shook her head, knowing this was the moment she had to go. If she stayed, she would only drag him into the nightmare that was her past. And she wouldn't, let that happen. "I'm sorry," she whispered, turning toward the door once more. Ethan didn't stop her this time. He simply stood there, his walls rising back up, shutting her out completely. The warmth that had begun to grow between them turned to ice. As she stepped out into the cold night, she didn't look back. Because if she did, she knew she wouldn't have the strength to leave. The silence in Ethan's mansion was deafening. He sat in his office, staring at the empty glass in his hand, the amber liquid untouched. His mind was a battlefield, waging war between logic and emotions. He told himself he never truly cared, that Lena's departure was a relief, that she was just a mystery, a puzzle that had intrigued him for a moment before shattering into pieces he had no intention of picking up. Yet, the gnawing ache in his chest told a different story. The past few days had felt like an eternity, each moment weighed down by regret. He had pushed her away, convinced himself she was a liar, and let her run, perhaps straight into the arms of the danger she had tried so desperately to escape. James, ever the silent observer, finally spoke. "If you didn't care, sir, then why haven't you been able to focus on anything else?" Ethan's jaw clenched. "She lied, James. She was engaged to a powerful man. She played me." James tilted his head, studying him. "Or she was running from something she was too afraid to share." Ethan said nothing. He wanted to believe that Lena had deceived him, but deep down, he knew better. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the pain buried beneath her guarded exterior. And yet, he had let his pride dictate his actions. Meanwhile, Lena struggled to survive on her own once more. The bitter wind bit at her skin as she sat huddled in the corner of a rundown motel, her meager savings dwindling. She had promised herself she wouldn't return. She wouldn't go crawling back to Ethan, not when he had made it clear that she was nothing more than a mistake. But as exhaustion weighed heavily on her, doubts crept in. Was she truly better off alone? Could she keep running forever? And what if this time, the past she had spent years escaping finally caught up to her? Her hands trembled as she reached for the remote, switching on the small television in the room. The news anchor's voice sent a chill down her spine. Authorities have confirmed that Alexander Graves, CEO of Graves Industries, has launched an extensive search for a missing woman believed to be Lena Carter. Sources claim she was last seen in New York City. Lena's blood ran cold. They had found her. She had stayed too long, left too many breadcrumbs. And now, Alexander knew where she was. Panic surged through her, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had to move now. She grabbed her bag, stuffing the few belongings she had inside. But before she could reach the door, a sharp knock echoed through the room, freezing her in place. Ethan had spent the past few hours trying to convince himself to let it go, to forget about her. But then the news had reached him, and suddenly, everything else faded away. "Sir, you need to see this." James placed the tablet in front of him, and Ethan's eyes narrowed as he read the headline. His heart pounded against his ribs as he took in the details. Lena was in danger. The very man she had been hiding from was closing in. Without a second thought, Ethan was on his feet, grabbing his coat. James followed, his expression unreadable. "Sir, what are you planning to do?" Ethan's voice was firm, unyielding. "I'm going to find her." The drive to the motel felt endless. His mind raced with every possible scenario. Was she safe? Had they already found her? The thought of her alone, terrified, sent a surge of urgency through him. When he finally arrived, he barely took the time to park before rushing inside. The receptionist barely had time to react before Ethan was demanding Lena's room number. His heart pounded as he sprinted down the dimly lit hallway. And then he heard it, the sharp knock on her door. Someone had beaten him there. Lena pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow as the knock came again. "Lena," a familiar voice called, smooth, controlled, and laced with danger. "I know you're in there. Open up." "Alexander." She swallowed hard, every muscle in her body screaming for her to run. But there was nowhere to go. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. Just as she reached for the window, the door burst open. A scream caught in her throat as Alexander stepped inside, his piercing gaze locking onto her. "You've been very difficult to find," he murmured, stepping closer. "But you should have known I'd never let you go." Lena's fingers curled into fists. "I'm not going back with you." A slow smile curved his lips, one that sent ice through her veins. "Oh, but you don't have a choice." Before she could react, a sudden force crashed into the room. The sound of a struggle, the sharp crack of a fist meeting flesh. And then she saw him. Ethan. His face was set in a storm of fury as he shoved Alexander back, positioning himself between Lena and the man who had haunted her past. "She's not going anywhere with you." Alexander straightened, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Ah, the billionaire's savior," he sneered. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." Ethan's stance was unwavering. "I don't care. Lena's heart pounded. No one had ever fought for her like this. No one had ever looked at her with such fierce determination, as if she was worth saving. For the first time in years, she felt something other than fear. Hope. As the tension in the room thickened, Ethan turned slightly, his voice firm yet gentle. "Lena, we're leaving. Now." She hesitated for only a second before nodding. This time, she wouldn't run alone. This time, she had someone willing to fight for her. Lena sat in the dimly lit room, her wrists bound, the air thick with tension. The cold concrete walls closed in around her as the weight of her past crashed down. She had spent years running, but it had finally caught up. A familiar voice echoed from the doorway. A man she once trusted but now feared. "You thought you could disappear, Lena?" His voice was smooth but laced with menace. "Did you really believe I wouldn't find you?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. She wouldn't let him see her break. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in his office, drowning himself in work, but nothing could distract him from the gnawing emptiness in his chest. Lena was gone, and he had done nothing to stop it. His mansion, once bustling with her presence, now felt eerily silent. He had convinced himself he didn't need her, but the truth hit him like a sledgehammer. He did, more than he was willing to admit. His fingers gripped the edges of his desk as he stared at the pile of reports he hadn't read. Nothing mattered. Not the deals, not the empire he had built. Only the image of Lena, defiant yet vulnerable, haunted him. At the same time, Lena sat motionless, her thoughts drifting back to Ethan. She had promised herself she wouldn't rely on anyone, but with him, it had been different. He had made her feel safe, even when she tried to push him away. And now, she might never see him again. Days passed. Ethan barely ate, barely slept. He moved through his life in a haze, but the ache didn't fade. His staff noticed, whispered about the shift in their boss. He was colder, harsher, yet somehow emptier. Then, the breaking point came. He entered his bedroom, and his eyes landed on something small, yet significant. Lena's scarf, draped over the chair where she used to sit and read. It smelled like her, held the last traces of her presence. A surge of pain ripped through him. He pressed the fabric to his face, as if he could hold onto a piece of her. Lena, on the other hand, sat in silence as the man before her paced the room. She had no fight left. Every attempt to escape had been met with ruthless force. Her body ached, her spirit even more. Was this the end? Had she finally lost the battle she had been fighting for so long? Ethan's mind warred with itself. He had convinced himself he was better off without her, that he didn't need to chase after a woman who had kept secrets from him. But then, a sickening thought settled in. What if she was in danger? What if she needed him, and he had turned his back? That thought clawed at his insides until he couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed to find her. He needed to bring her back, before it was too late. The night outside was restless, mirroring the storm brewing in his soul. Ethan reached for his phone, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. He was done pretending. It was time to bring Lena home. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The world outside bustled with life, but inside, he felt hollow. His mansion, once a place of solitude, now echoed with an emptiness that gnawed at him. Lena was gone, and he had let her go. For days, he buried himself in work, convincing himself that this was for the best. But no matter how many deals he signed or how much wealth he amassed, a single thought plagued him. He had pushed away the only person who had ever made him feel alive. The truth haunted him, whispering in the silence of the night. He had accused her, doubted her, and watched her walk away. And now, he couldn't ignore the ache in his chest. He had to know the truth, the full truth. Determined, Ethan called in one of the most elite private investigators in the country. The man's report arrived within hours, a thick file placed before him on his desk. With a deep breath, Ethan flipped it open, his heart pounding with each revelation. Lena had been engaged to a powerful man, Vincent Moreau, a name Ethan recognized well. Ruthless, controlling, and dangerous, Moreau had built his empire on manipulation and cruelty. The reports detailed years of psychological torment Lena had endured, culminating in her desperate escape. Moreau had been searching for her ever since. Ethan's hands clenched into fists as he read the accounts of the abuse she had suffered, the bruises she had hidden, the fear that had shadowed her every step. And yet, she had kept moving forward, refusing to be broken. He had judged her without knowing her struggle, without understanding the strength it had taken for her to survive. Guilt crashed over him in waves. He had failed her, but he wouldn't make that mistake again. Without hesitation, Ethan activated every resource he had. His connections, his wealth, his influence. He would use them all to find her. He owed her that much. More than that, he needed her. Hours stretched into a sleepless night, but finally, a lead surfaced. Lena had been taken. Moreau's men had found her and dragged her back into the life she had fought to escape. The location was a heavily guarded estate on the outskirts of the city. Ethan didn't waste a second. He gathered his most trusted security team and set out. The drive was tense, the air thick with unspoken urgency. As they neared the estate, his pulse roared in his ears. He had been blind to his feelings for too long. But now, there was no doubt, he loved her, and he would fight for her. The estate loomed ahead, its towering gates sealing her fate. But not for long. Ethan moved with calculated precision. His men overpowered the guards at the perimeter, moving swiftly and silently through the dark corridors. The further they went, the heavier the weight in his chest became. He could only imagine what she had been through in the past few days. He just hoped he wasn't too late. Then he saw her. Lena was curled in a corner of a dimly lit room, her arms wrapped around herself. The fire in her eyes had dimmed, her spirit worn thin. At the sound of footsteps, she flinched, her body stiffening as if preparing for another blow. But when she looked up and saw him, something flickered in her gaze. Disbelief, shock, and beneath it all, a fragile hope. Ethan, her voice was barely a whisper, cracked and broken. His chest ached at the sight of her. "I'm here," he said, stepping forward, "and I'm taking you home." Tears welled in her eyes, but she shook her head. "You shouldn't have come. He'll never stop." "I don't care." Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. "I won't let him hurt you again. Ever." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched his. Ethan grasped her hand, pulling her up into his arms, holding her close as if anchoring her to him. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped them back to reality. Moreau's men had realized the intrusion. Ethan's team moved swiftly, a fierce fight breaking out in the hallway. He shielded Lena, guiding her through the chaos, never letting go of her hand. The adrenaline surged, but his focus remained on one thing, getting her out of there. Finally, they burst through the doors into the cool night air. Ethan's car waited, engines revving. Without hesitation, he lifted Lena into the back seat and slid in beside her, his arm protectively wrapped around her as they sped away from the nightmare she had endured for so long. Lena leaned against him, exhausted but safe. She looked up at him, searching his face. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "After everything, why did you come for me?" Ethan met her gaze, his own filled with emotions he could no longer deny. "Because I love you." Her breath hitched, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Ethan," he wiped a stray tear away, his touch gentle. "I was a fool to let you go, but I won't make that mistake again." Lena let out a shaky breath, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was something new in her expression, a fragile belief, a willingness to hope again. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan knew he had done something right. As the city lights blurred past them, he held her close, knowing this was just the beginning. He had found her, and this time, he wouldn't let her go. The world felt different now. The chaos had settled, yet Lena stood at a crossroads, unable to move forward. She sat by the window of the small and Ethan had brought her to after the rescue, watching the rain paint streaks across the glass. The safety she had once craved was finally within reach, yet her heart twisted with uncertainty. Could she truly stay? Could she risk bringing more destruction into Ethan's life? She heard a soft knock at the door. Her fingers curled against her palms as she hesitated before whispering, "Come in." Ethan stepped inside, his presence filling the small room with warmth she hadn't realized she'd missed so desperately. His suit was slightly wrinkled, a rare sight for the man who always appeared untouchable, composed. Yet tonight, he looked different, softer, wearier, but determined. "You haven't spoken much since we got here," he said, voice low, careful. "Are you all right?" Lena let out a breathy laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I don't know what all right is anymore." Ethan moved closer, but kept a careful distance, sensing her hesitation. "You're free now, Lena. You don't have to keep running." She looked up at him, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his eyes. "I appreciate everything you've done for me, Ethan. But you don't understand. Being with me comes with a cost. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything." Ethan's jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. Then, he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "Do you think I care about any of that?" Lena looked away. "You should." "I don't." His voice was firm, unwavering. "I care about you. Not your past. Not what people say. You. And I'm not here to demand anything from you. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. But if you stay, I want it to be your choice. No conditions. No expectations. Just us." Her breath caught. She had spent so much of her life trapped by fear, by circumstance, by the people who sought to control her. And here was Ethan, offering her something she had never been given before, freedom. The choice was hers to make, without manipulation or force. Tears stung her eyes, and for the first time in years, they weren't from pain or fear. "You would really let me go?" Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line, and he exhaled through his nose. "If that's what you truly want." Lena searched his face, looking for any sign of deception, but there was none. Just honesty. Just love. A love she had once believed she would never deserve. A sob escaped her before she could stop it. She turned away, hugging herself as emotions swirled inside her like an uncontrollable storm. She had spent so long running, protecting herself from the pain of attachment, of loss. But now she realized something terrifying. She didn't want to run anymore. Her hands trembled as she turned back to him. "I don't want to leave, Ethan, but I'm scared." Ethan reached for her then, hesitating for only a moment before his fingers brushed against hers. "I'm scared too," he admitted, voice raw. "But I'd rather face that fear with you than spend another second without you." Lena sucked in a sharp breath, her walls crumbling. She surged forward, wrapping her arms around him, burying her face into his chest. Ethan held her like she was something precious, something he wasn't willing to let slip away again. And for the first time in a long time, Lena felt safe. Ethan pulled back just enough to look at her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Stay with me." She nodded, tears falling freely now. "Yes." Relief flickered across his face before he leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Lena closed her eyes, letting his warmth ground her. "Neither do you." Their reunion was not just a moment. It was a promise. A promise of healing, of love, of finally letting go of the past and stepping into a future together. And this time, neither of them would run. The sun filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow over the quiet room. Lena stood by the window, staring out at the vast stretch of countryside that now felt like home. The days of looking over her shoulder were long gone, replaced by a sense of peace she had never thought possible. She took a deep breath, feeling the steady rhythm of her heart, a heart that no longer beat in fear but in love. Behind her, Ethan stirred, his presence grounding her in the present. He had kept his promise. There were no conditions, no expectations, only love, pure and unwavering. Over time, they had built a life together, one founded on trust and resilience. Lena had taken her time healing, and Ethan had never once rushed her. He had fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself, but more than that, he had shown her what it meant to be truly safe. The past was behind them now. The nightmares that once haunted Lena's sleep had faded, replaced by dreams of the future. She had started working with a local organization that helped women who had been in situations like hers, Women who had once felt powerless but had found the strength to reclaim their lives. It was her way of giving back, of ensuring that no one else had to walk the road alone. Ethan entered the room, his gaze softening as he saw her lost in thought. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing a gentle kiss to the side of her head. "Penny for your thoughts?" he murmured. Lena smiled, leaning into him. "Just thinking about how far we've come. There was a time I never imagined a life like this. A life where I felt whole." He turned her to face him, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. "You were always whole, Lena. You just needed to see it for yourself." Her eyes shimmered, not with sadness, but with the depth of emotion she had learned to embrace. "I only saw it because you never gave up on me. Lena, I would go through it all again if it meant ending up here with you." His voice was steady, certain. "The past doesn't define us. We do. And together, we've made something stronger than fear." She traced the lines of his face, memorizing the man who had become her home. "Do you ever regret it? Taking me in that night?" Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not for a second. That night changed everything for me. I thought I was saving you, but you saved me too. You made me see what really matters." Lena exhaled, the weight of their journey settling in her chest. It had been a long road, filled with heartbreak and uncertainty. But they had found their way through it, step by step, moment by moment. A gentle breeze rustled the trees outside, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings. Lena turned back to the window, watching the sunlight dance across the fields. She felt Ethan's arms tighten around her, and for the first time in a long time, she believed in forever. "We made it, didn't we?" she whispered. Ethan kissed the top of her head. "Yes, we did, and we always will." Together, they stood unbreakable, proof that love, true, unwavering love, had the power to heal even the deepest scars. Lena stood by the large window of their home, staring out at the golden hues of the setting sun. The gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming roses from the garden, a scent she had come to associate with peace, a peace she never thought she would have. She had spent so many years running, looking over her shoulder, fearing the day her past would finally catch up with her. But now, those fears felt like a distant memory. The woman who once fought to survive on the streets, who believed she was unworthy of love, now stood as someone who had found not just love, but a home, a future, and herself. A warm hand slipped around her waist, pulling her back to the present. Ethan stood behind her, his touch firm yet gentle, grounding her. Lost in thought, his deep voice murmured against her ear. She smiled softly, leaning into him. "Just thinking about how much has changed." Ethan chuckled, resting his chin on her shoulder. "A lot has." She turned to face him, her eyes tracing the features of the man she had once thought was incapable of love. The man who had built walls so high that even he couldn't see past them. Yet here he was, holding her as if she was the most precious thing in the world. "You never gave up on me," she whispered. Ethan's eyes darkened with emotion. "Because you never gave up on me either." She reached up, cupping his face. "Do you regret any of it? Everything we went through?" He let out a slow breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "Not a single moment, because every step, every hardship, every painful truth led me to you." Lena felt the sting of tears behind her eyes. There was a time when she thought love was meant only for others, that it was a fairy tale she would never be a part of. But now, standing in the arms of the man who had fought for her, who had changed for her, she realized something. Love was never about perfection. It was about finding someone willing to fight through the imperfections, to stand by your side, even when the world turned its back. Ethan pressed a kiss to her forehead, his grip tightening. "I used to think love was a weakness, something I could never afford to feel. But you changed that. You changed me." She smiled, wrapping her arms around him. Sometimes the greatest love stories are written from the most unexpected beginnings. He pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes, his own filled with something unspoken. A promise, a devotion that needed no words. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lena closed her eyes, breathing in the moment. No longer was she running. No longer was she afraid. She was exactly where she was meant to be, wrapped in the arms of the man who had become her home. And for the first time in her life, she truly believed in forever.